Ramadan is a month in Islam marked by fasting from dawn to sunset, increased worship, and stronger community routines, including shared evening meals when the fast is broken. In many households, Ramadan also increases hosting and family gatherings. My focus is what Ramadan makes unusually visible in my home. Not explicit rules, but a routine gender division of labor that becomes treated as normal. My thesis is that Ramadan hostings in my household function as gendered care work enforced through respectability, where the cost of refusing is reputational and the cost of complying is academic and emotional depletion. I will be using a reoccurring Ramadan hosting situation as my personal experience because it captures how gendered expectations operate in everyday life. I will focus on one specific night because it represents the pattern. After a full day of university responsibilities, commuting, classes, deadlines, and research commitments, I came home fasting and already behind on schoolwork. That night, guests arrived. Without any discussion, the division of roles was already set. The men and boys sat and were served, while the women moved between the kitchen and the table. When tea was requested, when plates needed refilling, when something had to be cleaned quickly, eyes turned towards me. No one formally assigned me those tasks, but the expectation was clear. As the eldest daughter, I was supposed to step in immediately and keep the evening running smoothly. What stayed with me is that the work was never assigned, yet the consequences of not doing it were perfectly understood. This is important. What I'm describing is not only chores, it is care work with both visible and invisible components. The visible part is easy to list: cooking, setting up, serving, washing dishes, cleaning. The invisible part is harder to name, but often more draining. Noticing who needs attention, making sure older relatives are comfortable, preventing conflict, responding politely even when I'm exhausted, and keeping the atmosphere pleasant. I am using care work here in the core sense, the work that sustains relationships in daily life, and that often becomes taken for granted because it's treated as ordinary rather than recognized as labor. A key point from Song's Week 5 reading is that care work can be socially necessary and still be positioned as low status and undervalued. There's also a specific emotional layer to this work that the course helped me name. I'm not only completing tasks, I'm managing how I appear while I do them. Even when I'm tired, I'm expected to sound calm, look patient, and move as if nothing is difficult. Building on Hochschild's concept of emotional labor, Kong explains this as managing feeling and expression so that other people experience comfort and ease. That's what's happening here. The expectation is not just to serve, but to serve in a way that produces a smooth atmosphere for everyone else. The impact is both practical and psychological. Practically, hosting nights take hours, and during Ramadan, those hours come at the most limited time of day, after fasting, when I also need to study and sleep. On nights like this, I often start studying very late, sometimes close to midnight, and I feel the consequences the next day: weaker focus, less preparation, and more stress. Emotionally, I experience a cycle: resentment that this is repeatedly placed on me, followed by guilt for even feeling resentment because the labor is framed as love, family duty, and religious virtue. That framing matters because it shapes identity. I'm not only deciding whether to help, I'm negotiating what it means to be seen as a good Muslim woman and a good eldest daughter. Here is what I learned from this pattern. What gets called helping is not neutral. It's structured by gendered expectations. I also learned that refusal is not interrupted as a reasonable boundary. It is often interrupted as a moral failure. That guilt matters analytically because it shows how social expectations become internal rules. Refusal doesn't feel like a neutral choice, it feels like doing something wrong. Song's Week 4 reading describes respectability as a moral force that disciplines behavior through judgment and reputation, even when nobody gives direct orders. Right after describing the impact, I want to show why this doesn't feel like a one time situation. It functions like a self reinforcing cycle. It starts with social expectation. Even without anyone assigning roles, there is a shared assumption about what the eldest daughter will do. That expectation triggers hosting labor, serving, cleaning, and managing the atmosphere. Because it's happening after fasting and late in the day, it leads to depletion, less sleep, and less time for school. Then the emotional part kicks in: moral pressure or guilt. Because the work is framed as duty and virtue, so even thinking it's unfair feels wrong. That guilt pushes self silencing and compliance. I just do it instead of asking for redistribution. And because I comply, the pattern becomes normalized and repeats at the next gathering. So the key point is the cycle keeps going, not because someone keeps ordering me, but because the expectations become internal and the cost of refusing feels socially risky. To analyze the scene, the first lens I'm using is care work and its de evaluation. This is where I saw the clearest connection to Song's argument about how necessary care labor can still be treated as low status. On the surface, my Ramadan hosting role is easy to describe as helping out. I'm making tea, carrying plates, refilling cups, cleaning quickly so guests feel taken care of. But the way this gets interrupted matters because these actions are treated as natural, as if they come from my personality, my upbringing, or my faith, rather than treated as work that uses real time and energy. Song's Week 5 reading frames this clearly. Song argues that care work can be publicly recognized as important and still be positioned as inferior labor, low status, and low reward, even when it's essential for households to function. In my family setting, I see that contradiction immediately. Hosting looks effortless only because someone is making it look effortless. Even something as simple as the tea round isn't a one time task, it repeats, and each round restarts the work. And the recognition I receive rarely names it as labor. Instead, it comes as a compliment that actually erases the work. You are so well raised, or comments about how smoothly I serve, as if the way that I hold a teapot is proof of moral character rather than evidence of effort. Song also helps explain why this arrangement is so easy to accept, even when it's exhausting. When care work is tied to relationships, approval, and closeness, it can function like the reward that substitutes for fair conditions. In my case, the payment is family pride, sometimes framed in marriage oriented terms such as wife behavior. That praise matters because it disciplines me. It keeps me performing the work without complaint because the work isn't treated as negotiable. It's treated as proof that I'm good enough. To deepen the analysis, the second lens I'm using is respectability and self governance. How gendered expectations get enforced without anyone needing to give direct instructions. This lens matters because what keeps the pattern going is not a rule written down, it is the fear of how refusal will be read. The main reason this experience repeats is not that anyone gives me a direct order. It repeats because the expectation is enforced indirectly through what feels socially acceptable for me to do and what feels socially dangerous to refuse. Song's Week 4 reading gives me language for that mechanism. In her 2010 work, Song argues that respectability is not simply a personal trait. It functions as a moral force that supports coercive power. In plain terms, people don't need to tell you what to do if reputational judgment will do the enforcing for them. This helped me see that the enforcement isn't a person standing over me, it's a reputational system that makes me govern myself in advance. Song also explains how modern forms of governing rely on producing responsible individuals, people expected to self manage, where dependence becomes ethically inappropriate. So instead of asking for redistribution, you're expected to cope quietly. That maps onto my Ramadan hosting psychologically. When the work begins, I don't experience it as someone is making me do this, or I experience it as it would be wrong for me not to. This internal script is immediate. Be patient, don't complain, don't embarrass your mother, don't look tired. This is where the gendered expectation becomes more than a chore, it becomes a performance standard. The expectation is not only that I serve and clean, it's that I do it with the correct emotional presentation calm, smiling, unbothered. In my community context, that performance gets read as character and respectability. Well raised, wife qualities. That framing matters because it makes refusal morally loaded and it creates a second layer of labor self monitoring, monitoring my face tone and attitude so nobody sees strain. Emotionally, that produces a specific kind of exhaustion. Not only physical fatigue from fasting and working, but the stress of self monitoring. Monitoring my face, my tone, my attitude so nobody sees strain. This is why the work is so difficult to interrupt. Respectability does not demand labor, it demands that the labor looks effortless. For the third lens, I'm focusing on why asking for fairness can feel risky rather than empowering. Because the decision isn't only about the workload, it's also about the social consequences of speaking up. A reasonable question is, why not redistribute the work? Why not ask your brothers to serve tea or clean, especially when you're fasting and still have academic responsibilities? Choose Week 6 reading helps me answer that in a structural way. In her 2013 work, Chu argues that when people consider asserting demands, they often calculate not only practical outcomes, but also the material and moral costs, the costs of how they will be judged and treated afterwards. In my Ramadan scene, asking for fairness isn't interpreted as a neutral request. It risks being interpreted as a statement about who I am. If I say, I need someone else to do the tea round, it can be read as disrespectful, ungrateful, or failing the culturally preferred image of a good eldest daughter. It can also be read as breaking the emotional script because the script is not simply to serve, but to serve willingly. This is why silence becomes a strategy. The cost of speaking is not only being told no, the cost is social relabeling. Difficult, selfish, too Western, not humble, not patient. Those labels matter because they attach to reputation and family image. And I know that if conflict happens, I will likely be expected to manage the emotional aftermath as well. So this produces a double bind. If I comply, I pay with time, sleep, and academic stability. If I refuse, I pay socially, judgment, tension, and the responsibility of repairing the atmosphere. Under these conditions, silence isn't passivity. It's a rational response to a system where speaking creates moral risk and additional emotional work. Reading these texts changed how I interpret my own reactions. Before this course, I explained the situation throughout personality and morality. I'm caring, I'm the eldest, Ramadan is about being generous, so I should naturally take on this role. After engaging with the course readings, I interpret it as differently. I can still value care and faith, but I now see how care becomes organized as labor, how respectability turns gender expectations into internal roles, and how this moral cost of speaking discourages redistribution. The biggest shift is that I no longer read my exhaustion or resentment as personal weaknesses. I read it as evidence of patterned inequality reproduced through norms, not explicit orders. To conclude, this report has shown that my Ramadan hosting role is not simply a personal preference or a family habit. It is a recurring form of unpaid care and emotional labor that becomes assigned to me throughout gendered expectations, especially through the idea that a good eldest daughter should serve, anticipate needs, and do it without complaint. At a sociocultural level, this reflects a broader pattern. In many families and communities, women's labor becomes the invisible infrastructure that makes social life feel smooth and successful, while men are more socially permitted to remain guests inside their own homes. What makes the pattern powerful is that it often does not require direct enforcement. It is maintained throughout respectability, throughout reputational judgment, and the fear of being read as morally failing if you refuse. This matters for gender equality because equality is not only about public opportunities like education or careers, it is also about the private organization of time, rest, and responsibility. When women are expected to carry the emotional and domestic maintenance of the household, they lose time, energy, and academic stability. Yet the loss is framed as normal. So the solution is not individual endurance, it is collective change, naming this work as work, recognizing it rather than treating it as personality, and redistributing it across gender and age. It also means challenging the moral framing that turns women's exhaustion into proof of devotion. If care is truly valued, it should be shared, not silently extracted. Thank you so much for listening.